Hello, hello, and happy Wednesday! This week's video is again inspired by nature. Check out this little guy. This little porcupine has been coming into our yard most of the summer. At first, I think he was coming here with his mom because we saw the two of them and she was a whole lot bigger than he was. I've noticed recently that he is coming more so by himself, and he's probably in the process of starting to venture out on his own more and more. Oh my goodness, he is so cute. And if I didn't have anything else to do, I swear I could watch him for hours. Oh, it kind of reminds me of being a kid and watching Lauren Green's New Wilderness. It was one of my favorite shows. I've always loved nature documentaries, and even to this day, I watch a lot of David Attenborough's documentaries, and I just love nature. So this week's video is inspired by that little porcupine, and again, I am not gonna paint a porcupine like I didn't paint a frog last week, but I am gonna paint foliage. And I guess he inspired me to paint foliage because he's filling his belly with our clover, and I have noticed on my nature walks that the foliage is starting to shift. It is starting to change. It has not completely gone into the fall colors just yet, but I am noticing a change. And so I wanted to create some little paintings to sort of pay homage to nature and the changing seasons. And so I'm creating what I guess could be considered a little diptych, but I think it would also be nice as two little individual paintings. And I'm practicing a few skills using salt, and I'm also trying something new that I've never done before. So I'm super happy with how it all turned out. I wasn't so sure at first that it would turn out, but it did. So I hope you'll feel inspired to join me and pick up your paintbrushes and get painting foliage of your own. Or if you just feel like relaxing, like I always say, grab your favorite cup of whatever, sit down and relax with me. I would love to have you here with me. Let's get going. I'm starting my process by using my favorite background color, which is a mix of blue and light red that creates this sort of like bluish gray. And I'm creating a really light wash over both little pieces of paper. I have taped each piece of paper to its own board because there's something I want to do, and it requires me to be able to move these two pieces separately. And you'll soon see what it is I'm going to do. It's something I've never done before, but I thought, I think I want to try that and see how it turns out and what it does. So just wait and see. It's kind of fun, not overly complicated. Actually, not complicated at all. um, don't know, how it turns out, but I think it did create some cool effects. So after adding my first layer of color, I just come in with some salt because that's going to help to create some texture in my background. And then I'll let everything dry and move on to the next step. I've pulled out these little dishes that I got from, I think, a fondue set or something. I don't really remember. Maybe sushi? I don't know, but they never served any purpose in the kitchen, and for me, they serve a great purpose here in my art studio, so I love using them, even though I don't pull them out very frequently. What I intend to do and why I'm using these little dishes instead of my color palette, my normal color palette, is I am mixing a fair amount of this liquid watercolor, and I am going to pour my paint on top of one of the panels and then smush the paint with my other panel to transfer the color onto the other panel. I've never done this with acrylic paint. I've done it, sorry, with watercolor paint. I've done it with acrylic paint, but I've never done it with watercolor, and I'm sort of curious to see what's going to happen. If anything different will happen, maybe nothing will really change, but it's a different way of applying the paint. And like I say, I love to experiment and play, and so why not give it a try? Once I'm finished applying the salt, I'm going to let everything dry once again, and then I'm going to repeat this process, this time using color that is more pigmented and has less water. And I'll use a tiny bit less paint and water this time than I did the first time. I think I might have gone a little bit overboard. And I want to intensify the colors, so I'm really trying to keep it less liquid. So more pigment, less water, and we're gonna just repeat the same process as I did in the very first step. I thought I had used too much water the first time I did this, and it turns out that the second time I did it, I used not enough. So I'm coming in with my spray bottle and I'm just adding a little bit more water so that the paint can spread a little bit more. I do want to intensify the colors, so I don't want to dilute my watercolors too much, but at the same time, I do want to make sure that there is colors spread mostly around the painting or the background. It doesn't have to cover the whole entire thing because my foliage won't cover the whole entire thing. And I do want to preserve some of what I created with my initial wash of color. So I'll just continue spreading the paint with this straw, and then I think I will add some splatters of that darker green paint, which I think is Hooker's green. And after adding the splatters, I think I'll be ready to let it dry and move on to my next part of the process. After everything was dry, I took one of my pencils and I drew in some leaf shapes, not anything very specific, some leaves that I have seen in the forest when I'm out on my walks, but I'm not 100% sure what they're called. I just know that I see them on the ground here and there. I don't know if they're little saplings or what they are exactly, but I do love how the leaves are bunched together, and so that's why I was inspired to paint these little plants in particular. But I think any type of foliage using this technique would probably end up very pretty. To brighten things up, I've decided to use some of my quinacridone burnt orange and basically delineate all of the leaf shapes that I've created using my pencil. And this color goes really well with the green, and I think it makes the green stand out a little bit more. If I were to apply this color when the green was wet, I would have had a hard time with them not creating a brownish color. And that's not really what I want to go for. It probably would have been okay, but I really wanted to keep some of the brightness of that quinacridone burnt orange. And so by using it after the green has already dried, I can preserve some of the brightness of that color. The quinacridone burnt orange tends to be more like a reddish orange. At some point, I may also use some quinacridone deep gold because that's a little bit more warm. And so I'll add it here and there if I feel like I need to brighten up certain areas. But I do really love the look of that quinacridone burnt orange over the green. I'm trying to keep the layers very diluted and light so that I can still preserve some of these beautiful textures that were created by the salt and the different layers of green paint. I'm choosing to work with a fairly small round brush here because I have to go in between my leaves, and I think it would be harder for me to do that, of course, with a bigger brush. But this can pose a challenge when you're trying to cover also a large portion of the paper. And so the key here is to try as much as possible to keep the edges of the paint that's being applied wet. As long as I keep those edges wet, the paint will continue to mix into the background and it will not create any really hard lines. But if I let the paint dry, it will create a hard line. So I have to work relatively quickly and always be mindful of keeping those edges wet. And as long as I do that, it shouldn't be a problem. Now, like anything else, I always say when you're working, it's always good to experiment and try different things because your paper may stay wet longer than mine. I mean, right now it's pretty humid here in Maine, so my paper is not tending to dry very quickly. But if it was really hot, dry summer, or even in the winter when it does get a lot drier, and my paper dries more quickly, then I have to be even more careful. But again, experiment, try things, see how your supplies are working for you, and learn to be friends with your supplies. And be flexible. Flexibility is extremely important in working as an artist, especially with watercolors, because watercolor can be very sensitive to its environment. So if the environment is more dry, it'll dry faster. That'll change how it's working for you on your paper. If it's more humid, it'll also work differently. So it's important to have a chance to experiment and experience these different types of environments or situations so that you know how to adapt whenever your environment changes with the changing seasons. For my second little painting, I am working with the same color, quinacridone deep orange, and I'm repeating what I did in the first painting. My foliage is slightly different in this painting, but it is relatively similar, I guess, to the other little painting. And so this is a great opportunity for me to practice those skills that I was telling you about. So blending that color out so that I don't leave any really stark dark edges with my color application, and that I always continue to blend the color before it gets to dry. So again, this is the type of thing that's really fun to practice and good to practice because it can help improve our skills working with our brushes, and it can help us get really comfortable with our paints. Once I've removed all of my salt off the paper, I am now going to start using my number 2 round brush to add some more definition to my shapes and also add some color contrast using some of that Hooker's green. It's a nice dark green, and when it's not too diluted, it can be relatively dark, and so it is a good color for this painting in particular to add some dark value contrast. I want to keep defining my leaves, but I'm not going for a realistic look. That's not really the kind of artist I am. I love to work more abstract, although this is not really an abstract. This is more of, I mean, it looks like leaves, I think. So for that reason, it's not really an abstract. But at the same time, it is not exactly as leaves that you would see in nature. Although I do find that at this time of the year, when the leaves are just starting to change, they do have a little bit of that um, textured color that you can see here that was created by the salt. And I do like that. And that's one of the reasons I was inspired to work on these little paintings. So I'm trying my best to sort of replicate what I see in nature, but I'm not really concerning myself too much with creating what I see exactly in nature because that's just not the point of my exercise.
At this point, my foliage is more defined, and yet I feel like I still need to add a little bit more dark value contrast. So I'm going to use my dotting pen to do a little bit of stippling around the foliage, around the leaves, but I'm going to keep it fairly minimal. I don't want to create a lot of stippling around the leaves. Not that it would necessarily look bad, but I'm creating areas of more intense stippling in the areas that where it might be darker, like in between the leaves, for instance, and then I'm going a little bit lighter around the leaves. And so you'll see as I go along what I mean by this. Hopefully, you'll see also how doing this, even though it is not a lot of stippling, will help to make the foliage stand out a little bit more from the background of the painting. now I'm going to start adding some vertical lines with my extra fine tip black pen. And I am going to do this slightly different on each of the paintings. On this painting, looking at it in portrait mode, I am going to add the lines vertically. And then on the other little painting, I think I'm going to try creating some horizontal lines instead to see which one of the two I like better. And if this were to be a diptych, I think it would also make it just a little bit interesting that they don't have the same kind of lines. But that's just me experimenting and trying things just because this is the only way I'll ever know whether or not I like doing it like this, is that I try it. And so, yeah, I'm just giving it a try. I think adding the lines to the background is also going to help the foliage stand out a little bit from the background, and I think this is going to add more interest to the paintings. I've mentioned this on a number of my videos, but I always prefer to create organic lines than creating very, very straight lines with my ruler. There's nothing wrong with doing that, it's just my preference to have more organic looking lines. However, I do like my lines to stay relatively straight, and so I use my ruler to create guidelines here and there in the painting so that I can sort of follow these lines and keep my lines relatively straight as I'm going along and not too slanted or angled. This is the way I prefer to do it, but as I always say, experiment and see what your preference is. And if, for instance, you would prefer to use your ruler to create all the lines, again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a personal preference for me, and I hope when you're painting that you really pay attention to your own personal preferences. I'm really glad I decided to do the vertical lines versus the horizontal lines. Now, looking at the two little paintings side by side, I definitely feel that I have a preference for the vertical lines. But I would have not known this had I not tried to do the horizontal lines. The horizontal lines look nice. They just, for whatever reason, do not speak to me the same way the vertical lines are speaking to me. So I think one last thing I am going to do for this painting, and this has been a little bit of a struggle for me, is I am really going to resist the urge to add a lot of gold to this painting. Oh, I mean, I think initially when I started this process, I was thinking that painting my veins within the leaves with gold would have looked really beautiful, and it might still look really beautiful, but I actually really love the leaves as they are right now, so I've decided I'm just going to leave them be. I'm adding some little splatters of hooker's green, and I'm also going to add some splatters of gold because I do want to have some gold, but I'm going to resist the urge to put more than just those little splatters. I really love how these two little paintings have turned out, but as normal, I always feel like removing the tape is the thing that will really let me know whether or not my process is finished or not. And so I'm removing the tape and I'm gonna see how I feel once I see the paintings without the messy borders, and then I'll decide. But right now, I'm feeling like, yes, this is definitely the finished paintings. So here we have it, two finished little paintings on foliage. I don't know what type of foliage, but I know it's pretty and it reminds me of the foliage I'm currently seeing in the forest that's starting to yellow a little bit and have these beautiful little specks of color as they start to prepare for the fall season. It was a very simple little project, but so much fun at the same time. And maybe that much more fun for the fact that it was simple. I find with art, the more simple I keep things, the more enjoyable I tend to find my process. Thank you again for making the time to join me on my creative journey. I hope you have the most wonderful week, and remember, sweet friends, happy creating!